Hello everyone, and welcome back to another entry of iKenSleep. I hope you guys have been taking good care of yourselves as we get through the middle of February already. And I hope you guys have also been enjoying these entries of Heaven Official's Blessing. If you do and would like for me to continue, as well as in the future start other book series, please support me by leaving me likes, leaving some comments, sharing my stuff, and following me on my platforms like YouTube at iKenWin, Spotify at iKenSleep, TikTok at iKenWin, and Instagram at officially.iKenWin. Now without any further ado, let's get back into Heaven Official's Blessing. Chapter 6, Clothes Redder Than Maple, Skin White as Snow. Of course, those were words he would never say out loud, but no wonder Nanfang and Fu Yao's faces changed when they heard about the silver butterflies. They must have had a hard time at the hands of the silver butterflies' master, together with the two generals they served. Your Highness, did Hua Chang do anything to you? An official asked, as if Shilian should be missing an arm or a leg. He didn't really do anything, just... Shilian stopped, at a loss for words. Just what? He couldn't possibly say that Hua Chang just hijacked his sedan, held his hand, and strolled with him in the woods? Stumped for a moment, Shilian finally said, "He broke Swinji's enchantment array at Mount Yujun and took me inside." The heavenly officials all grumbled inwardly, but remained in uneasy silence. After a while, an official finally asked, "What do you all think of this?" From the voice alone, Shilian could imagine how the various officials looked as they shook their heads and shrugged. Who knows? Completely no idea. No one knows what he wants. How scary. What on earth is he thinking? No one can read that Hua Chang. Although Hua Chang had been ubiquitously known as the devil incarnate, Shilian didn't think he was that scary. And all things considered, Shilian had Hua Chang to thank for his help in the northern case this time around. Either way, his first mission after Ascension was complete. It was predetermined that all merits from the northern case would be counted under Shilian's name. But that old lord official was so overwhelmed with grief over the death of his daughter that he didn't actually remember to fulfill the promises of his prayers until much later, and the merits were discounted because he did so mournfully. Yet somehow, with a little bit here, a little bit there, and a lot of oversight everywhere, Shilian was finally able to repay most of the 8,880,000 merits. Shilian was at last debt-free, feeling light with that weight off his shoulders, happy and high-spirited. Shilian decided he'd now focus on being a good god, and it would be great if he could become acquaintances or friends with other heavenly officials. Even though the upper court communication array was generally peaceful, it would turn boisterous once things got busy. Sometimes if an official was feeling good or had encountered something interesting, they'd share in the array, and there'd be merriment. Although Shilian didn't recognize most of the voices, he would listen silently, but he couldn't always remain invisible. After a while, he'd randomly join the conversation. That really is quite interesting. I read this pleasant verse in passing. I thought I'd share with everyone. Here's an effective little cure for back and leg pains. Thought I'd share with everyone. Unfortunately, every time he'd share those mindfully selected, physically and mentally beneficial tips, the communication array would go silent. Finally, Ling Wen couldn't take it anymore and told him privately, "Your Highness, what you're sharing in the communication array is nice, but even those who are hundreds of years older than you wouldn't share those kinds of things." Shilian felt a little depressed. He wasn't even that old, so how did he end up becoming the senior among the heavenly officials, who couldn't keep up with the trending topics of the youngsters? Probably because he'd been away for too long and always lived a solitary life without a care for the outside world. Alas, it couldn't be helped. So whatever. He gave up and became less depressed. But there was another problem. There were still no new shrines built for him in the mortal realm. Maybe there were, but the heavens hadn't found them, so there weren't any records. Even old lords of the ground and soil had shrines. As a formally ascended official, one of 3 times at that, having neither shrine nor temple nor followers was pretty awkward. But, as awkward as it was only other heavenly officials feeling awkward for him. Xilian personally thought it wasn't that bad. And one day, on a whim, he suddenly thought, if no one worships me, I'll worship myself. None of the heavenly officials knew how to respond to that. Who ever fucking heard of a god worshipping himself? To reach such tragic heights, what was the point? However, Xilian was used to receiving nothing but awkward silence the moment he spoke, and thought amusing himself could be fun. Once he made up his mind, he jumped back down to the mortal realm. This time, he landed in a small village in the mountains. It was known as Puchi, named for the water chestnut. Rather than a village, it was more like a hillside hamlet. With green trees and clear waters, it was a pleasant country landscape. With continuous stretches of rice paddies. With such beautiful scenery, Xilian thought he'd landed in a really good place this time. When he looked further, he saw there was a small, dilapidated shack on a hill, and upon asking around, the villagers told him, that house is decrepit, there's no owner, and vagrants sleep at night in there every once in a while, so you can go make yourself at home. Well, wasn't that just perfect for him? Xilian walked toward the shack. As Xilian walked closer, he realized that the shack looked decrepit from afar, but on closer inspection, it was literally crumbling. 2 of the 4 columns that held up the rectangle-shaped shack was probably rotted through. When the wind blew, the entire shack would shake and creak, possibly ready to collapse at any time. But it was still within Xilian's range of acceptable. He went in for a look and began to tidy up the place. The villagers were quite surprised to see that someone was actually going to settle in that shack, and all came to check Xilian out. They gave Xilian a huge warm welcome. Not only did they donate a broom to help with cleaning and watch as he swept until he was covered in dust, they even gave him a basket of freshly picked water chestnuts. With their skin peeled off, the water chestnuts were white and crisp, fresh and juicy. Xilian squatted on the doorstep and ate them. He then put his hands together, and feeling thankful for this blessing, he decided to call this place Puchi Shrine. Puchi Shrine already had a table inside that could be used as the altar. After a couple wipe downs, Xilian busied himself with cleaning this and that, and the onlooking villagers soon realized that this young man was building a shrine of sorts. Curiosity overtook them, and they questioned him. Which god are you going to worship? Xilian cleared his throat and said, Yes, this shrine will be for the Prince of Shenle. Everyone's face went blank. Who's that? Xilian replied, I don't know either. He's a prince, I think. Oh, what does he do? Probably watches over you and keeps you safe, while collecting scraps in passing. The villagers asked excitedly, Then, does this prince oversee the blessing of wealth? It'd already be pretty good if you don't get blessed into debt, Xilian thought to himself and gently replied, I'm afraid not. The crowd started throwing suggestions at him. Why not worship the water master? For wealth. It'll bring in good money for the temple. What about Lingwen Shenjun? Then maybe our village will produce a scholar. A girl shyly offered. What about... Xilian maintained his smile. What about... General Zhu Yang? If Xilian really built a Zhu Yang shrine, Feng Xin would probably shoot him dead on the spot with an arrow. After roughly tidying his shrine, all that was left that Xilian needed were an incense burner, some fortune shakers, and other miscellaneous sundries. But Xilian forgot the most important thing, the statue of a god. He carried his bamboo hat on his back and stepped out the door. Oh yeah, there was no door either. He pondered for a moment. This shack definitely had to be repaired. And so Shilian wrote, and put a sign out front. Please kindly donate to the renovation of this broken shrine for the accumulation of good merits. Shilian left, walked for 3 to 4 kilometers, and entered town. To do what? To get a life, of course. So he went to do what he did best. In fairy tales, gods didn't need to eat. But in truth, it was hard to say. The Almighty could certainly extract and absorb the necessary spiritual energy directly from the sunlight and rain dew. But the problem was, it wasn't a matter of ability, but rather, why would you? Some gods, due to their cultivation methods, required clean internal organs and could not touch even a drop of mortal grease. If they were to ingest mortal sustenance, it would be as if they had been struck with food poisoning and they would get diarrhea. Thus, they would only ingest cleanly grown spiritual fruits, or magical beasts that had life-prolonging and power-strengthening effects. Shilian didn't have those problems. With the cursed collar on, he was no different than a mortal. He could eat anything, and through experience, nothing he ate could kill him either. Even if it was a bun that had been set aside for over a month, or a cake that had gone moldy, he could eat it all without harm. With such a body, he could pretty much get by just collecting scraps. To compare them, building a shrine cost him money, while collecting scraps made him money. So ultimately, truly, collecting scraps was better than ascension. Shilian had the looks and grace of a saint, so he had the upper hand when collecting scraps, and it took him almost no time to collect a giant bag. On the way back, he saw an old ox cart that was piled high with hay. The cart looked like one he'd seen before in Puchi village, so it should be going the same way. He asked for a ride, and the cart driver tilted his chin to signal for him to get on. Carrying his big bundle of junk, Shilian climbed on to take a seat. It was only when he settled down that he realized there was someone else lying on the other side of the tall stack of hay. This person, whose upper body was hidden behind the hay, had his left leg crossed over his right. It appeared that he was lying there with his arms pillowed behind his head, taking a rest. He looked so carefree and at ease that it made Shilian a little envious. That tight pair of black boots on a pair of long legs was a sight pleasing to the eyes, and it reminded Shilian of a different pair that walked with him at Mount Yujun. Shilian could not help but sneak several more looks to confirm that there were no silver chains on those boots, which seemed to be made of animal pelt. This is probably a young master coming out to play, he thought. The cart shook as it drove languidly. Shilian pushed back his bamboo hat and took out a scroll to read. He didn't really care for worldly affairs, but after having created too many awkward situations, he figured he'd better do some studying. The cart rattled and time passed. Looking up, they were traversing a maple grove, a sea of flaming red in a field of green. The rustic charm of the mountainous countryside, with fresh grass that refreshed the mind, was extremely intoxicating. But Shilian could not help but be slightly taken aback. A long time ago, in his youth, when he cultivated at the Royal Holy Temple, the entire mountain of maple was like this, shimmering like gold, intense like fire. The unforgettable sight before him now inevitably took him on a trip down memory lane. Shilian watched for a long time before looking down at the scroll. The first few lines on the scroll were thus: the Prince of Shenle ascended thrice as a martial god, a misfortune god, a rubbish god. Well, alright, Shilian said out loud. If you think about it, a martial god is no different than a rubbish god. All gods are equal. All beings are equal. A snicker came from behind, and a voice said, is that right? The youth on the other side of the cart lazily continued in the drawl. People naturally love saying that all gods are equal and all beings are equal. But if that were true, then pretty much all those different gods wouldn't exist. Shilian looked at the boy, who was still lying there idly without showing any intention of getting up. He had likely interrupted out of boredom. "You're probably right," Shilian said and smiled. Shilian returned to his scroll and continued reading. Further down, the line read, "Many believe that, as the god of misfortune, any paintings or writings of the Prince of Shenle have the powers of a curse. If placed on the back of a person, or on the main entrance of a household, then the cursed person or household will run into all sorts of bad luck." It was hard to tell whether this was a description of a god or a ghost. Shilian shook his head. He couldn't bear to read any more about himself. It was better to read about other prominent gods of today, so he wouldn't be discourteous if he ran into them and ended up not being able to tell them apart. A villager had mentioned the Water Master earlier, so Shilian moved on to find the description of the Water Master. The Water Master Wudu controls water and simultaneously wealth. Most merchants have a Water Master shrine in their stores and homes to guarantee their wealth. Shilian thought this was strange. Why would a god of water control wealth? The youth behind the hay responded, "When merchants transport goods, their cargo is mainly sent on the waterways, so they always go to the Water Master temple and light up a tall incense to pray for a safe journey, promising this or that when they return. After a while, the Water Master gradually came to control wealth." The youth was actually answering his questions specially for him. Shilian turned around. "Really? Interesting. The Water Master must be a very powerful major god then." The youth sneered. "Yeah. He's the water tyrant after all." Judging by tone, Shilian didn't think the boy took that particular heavenly official all that seriously. It didn't sound like he was complimenting him either. "What's the water tyrant?" The youth replied leisurely. "When a ship travels down a major river, it all depends on him whether the ship can set sail. No offerings means capsizing. Pretty tyrannical. So that's how he received the nickname. Kinda like General Zhu Yang and the Sweeping General. Famous gods usually had a nickname or two between all the realms. For example, Shilian was known as the laughingstock of the three realms, the infamous freak, the jinx, the loser, etc., etc. Usually, it was fairly disrespectful to use those nicknames on heavenly officials. Like if anyone were to call Muqing the Sweeping General, he'd surely fly in a rage. Shilian made a note to himself on what not to call the Water Master and said, "I see. Thanks so much for enlightening me." He paused briefly, and thinking this youth to be a rather intriguing conversationalist, he continued, "My friend, you look young, but you know a lot." The youth replied, "Nah, just bored. I read whatever when I'm free. That's all." In the mortal realm, it was easy to find books on lore that spoke of the stories of gods and ghosts, the subjects ranging from their kindnesses and grudges to trivialities. Some were real and some fake. It wasn't odd that the youth knew so much. Shilian put down his scroll. "Then, my friend, you know about gods, but do you know about ghosts too?" Which ghost?" the youth asked. Shilian replied, "Crimson Rain Sought Flower, Huachang." The youth chuckled and finally sat up when he heard that name. He turned around and Shilian's eyes suddenly lit up. The youth was about 16 or 17 years old. His tunic was redder than maple leaves, and his skin was white like snow. With eyes as bright as stars, he looked askance at him with a smile. He was exceptionally handsome, but there was an inexplicable hint of wildness in his looks. His hair was tied in a loose ponytail, crooked and carefree. The cart was driving through the forest of flaming red maples, where maple leaves danced their way to the ground. A leaf playfully landed on the shoulder of the youth, and he blew it off softly, then looked up at Shilian, speaking with a shadow of a smile. "What do you want to know? Ask away." He looked teasing, yet possessed the perfect composure for omniscience. Though he sounded youthful, his voice was deeper than was typical for his age and was pleasant to the ears. Sitting upright on the cart, Shilian watched him thoughtfully for a moment, then said, "Crimson Rain sought flower evokes quite the imagery. Do you know where it came from, my friend?" Out of respect, Shilian didn't say, "My little friend." The youth sat up casually, propped an arm up on a raised knee, and fixed his sleeves. He replied, unconcerned, "Nothing major, really. Just that there was once an incident where he cleaned out the nest of another ghost, and a shower of blood rain poured down from the skies. He saw a flower was getting battered by the bloody rain, so he tilted his umbrella and shielded it." Shilian pictured it in his head, imagining such an act of elegance under the rancid shower. He then thought about the burning of those 33 temples and laughed. "Does Huachang pick fights often?" The youth answered, "Not often. Depends on his mood." "What was he like before his death?" Shilian asked. "Definitely not a good person," the youth replied. "What does he look like?" The youth raised his eyes to look at him when he heard the question, tilted his head, and stood up before sitting down next to Shilian. "What do you think he looks like?" He turned the question on Shilian. Seeing the youth up close, Shilian thought he was too handsome for words. But his beauty was deadly like a sword, sharp and mesmerizing, making it hard to stare head on. Shilian only met his eyes for a moment, then lowered his eyes in defeat. He turned his head slightly and continued to ask, "If Huachang is a big shot ghost, I'm sure he has many forms and changes often." The youth arched his eyes at Shilian, turning away, and replied, "Yeah, but there are still times when he would use his real face. Of course, we're talking about his true form." It might have been his imagination, but Shilian thought the distance between the two of them seemed to be a little wide, so he turned his face back around. "Then I feel his true form is probably a youth like you." The youth lifted his lips slightly. "Why do you say that?" Shilian replied, "No reason. You say whatever and I think whatever. Everything is whatever, that's all." The youth laughed. "Who knows? But he's blind in one eye." He pointed to his right eye. "This one." This was nothing outrageous. Shilian recalled one of the many backstory versions where Huachang wore a black eye patch to hide that missing eye and asked, "Do you know what happened to his eye?" "That's a question everyone wants the answer to," the youth replied. Others asked because they wanted to know what Huachang's weakness was. But Shilian asked purely out of curiosity. He didn't say anything, and the youth continued, "He dug it out himself." Shilian was taken aback. "Why?" "A moment of madness. He could dig out his own eye when struck by madness." Shilian was now more curious than ever about this Crimson Ghost King. It couldn't have been something as simple as a moment of madness, but there were probably no more details about that story. Shilian pressed on. "Does Huachang have any kind of weakness?" He wasn't expecting the youth to have the answer. It was just a casual question. If Huachang's weakness was so easily known, then whatever the rumored weakness was couldn't possibly be true. But the youth answered immediately, "His ashes." If one got a hold of a ghost's ashes, one could take command of said ghost. If the ghost disobeyed, then by getting rid of the ashes, the ghost would dissolve and its soul disintegrate. This was common knowledge, but using it on Huachang seemed fruitless. Shilian smiled. "There's probably no one who can obtain his ashes, so that weakness is the same as having no weakness. You never know," the youth said. "There are circumstances where a ghost would voluntarily give away his ashes. Like the bet he had with those 33 heavenly officials?" "Yeah, right," the youth scoffed. He didn't need to say the words for Shilian to understand that he meant there was no way Huachang would have lost. He continued, "There's a custom in the ghost realm where if a ghost has a special someone, they entrust their ashes to that person. That was akin to handing over one's life to another person. Such passion. Such a charming tale that would be, Shilian commented, interested. I didn't know the ghost realm had such a romantic practice. They do, the youth said, but not many dare to practice it. Shilian thought as much. It wasn't only ghosts who deceived humans. There were humans who deceived ghosts too. There must be endless tales of manipulation and betrayal. Shilian sighed. It certainly is painful to think about. To have given everything for love and lose everything in return. The youth laughed out loud. What's there to be afraid of? If it were me, I'd have no regrets giving away my ashes. Who cares if they want me to disintegrate or just scatter the ashes for fun? Shilian grinned, then suddenly realized that they still didn't know each other's names despite having chatted for so long. My friend, what's your name? The youth raised one hand over his forehead to block out the rays of the blood-red sunset and squinted his eyes as if loathing the sun. Me? I'm third in my family. They call me Sanlang. He didn't say his full name, and it wasn't Shilian's place to ask. My family name is Shi. Given name is Lin. Are you heading to Puchi village too? Sanlang lay back into the hay, put his arms behind his head, and crossed his legs. Don't know. I have no destination in mind. It sounded as if there was a story to his words, so Shilian gently asked, What's the matter? Sanlang sighed. My parents were quarreling and kicked me out. I walked for a long time, but had nowhere to go. I almost passed out from hunger on the streets before finding somewhere at random to lie down. The clothes on the boy's back looked casual, but the material was of high quality. With the knowledgeable way he spoke and how carefree he appeared, Shilian had long since thought he was a boy from a wealthy family. It must be quite difficult for a respectable young man to wander so long on his own. Shilian understood that feeling. Hearing he was hungry, Shilian searched through his sack but only found a small steamed bun. Good thing it hadn't turned hard yet. Want it? The youth nodded, and Shilian gave him the bun. Sanlang took a look at Shilian. What about you? I'm alright. Not hungry yet, Shilian replied. Sanlang pushed the bun back. Then I'm alright too. Shilian looked at him, then split the bun in half and gave him half. You can have half, and I'll have the other half. Seeing this, Sanlang accepted the steamed bun and started munching. Watching him sit and eat a simple bun obediently, Shilian felt like he was abusing the boy. The ox cart drove slowly over the rugged hills as the sun gradually set and the two chatted in the back. The more they spoke, the more Shilian thought Sanlang to be an extraordinary youth. At such a young age, his diction and behavior were already mature and intelligent, calm and collected, as if there was nothing in this world he didn't know and nothing could stump him. Shilian thought he was wise beyond his years, but sometimes he would still reveal the folly of youth. Shilian said he was the shrine master of Puchi Shrine, and Sanlang asked, Puchi Shrine? Sounds like there are plenty of water chestnuts to eat. I like them. Which god is it for? Having been asked that troublesome question again, Shilian cleared his throat and said, The Prince of Shenla. You probably don't know him. The youth smiled, but before he could say anything, the ox cart suddenly shook violently. The two jerked with the cart, and Shilian reached to grab Sanlang, fearing he might fall. But just when his hand touched Sanlang, the youth shook off his hand as if burned. There was only a slight change in his expression, but Shilian saw it and thought, maybe this boy actually disliked him? They'd had such a good time chatting all this way though, hadn't they? But now wasn't the time to ponder. Shilian stood up and looked around. What's going on? The old driver responded. I don't know. Old Huang, why aren't you moving? Go on, now! The sun had set, and the ox cart was still in the deep woods, now filled with darkness. Old Huang the ox just stood there, stubbornly refusing to move no matter how the old driver urged it. It kept mooing, wanting to dig its head into the earth, and flicking its tail like a whip. This didn't feel right. Shilian was about to jump off the cart when suddenly, the old driver pointed straight ahead and screamed. Farther up the road, a number of hovering balls of green flames were popping up here and there. They gathered and burned, floating through the woods. A group of white-clad figures slowly made their way toward them, carrying their own severed heads. Seeing this, Shilian cried, "Protect!" Ryoye flew out from his sleeve and wrapped itself in a circle around the ox cart from above, protecting the three plus the one beast. Shilian turned back and demanded, "What day is it today?" The old driver didn't respond before the youth spoke up from behind. "It's Xiangyuan." The middle of the 7th month, when the gates to the underworld opened. He didn't check his calendar before coming out today, and it just happened to be the Xiangyuan festival. Shilian's voice dropped. "Stay close to me. We've run into evil tonight. If we go down the wrong path at the fork, we'll never return."